welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of two absolutely lovely books. They were beautiful reads, and they are absolutely essential reading, I think. I am so excited to talk about this author's life and their experiences and the books that they produced. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Thanks so much, Jen. My name is Ed DeGangi, or title on the top front covers of the books is Edward DeGangi. I currently live in Hillsborough, North Carolina, but spent the first 40 years of my life in and around Long Island. So I've got deep roots there, and it's a little bit like homecoming. So this is nice. The two books, the first book is called The Gift Best Given. It was published in 2020, just right into the teeth of the pandemic. And it was the story of my late adulthood search for the woman who had placed me for adoption at the time of my birth back in 1948. And the very surprising discoveries I made as I searched, the greatest of which was my mother had been a celebrity performer in the big ice skating spectaculars in the 1940s and 50s. In the course of writing that book, I developed a very profound appreciation for the experience of a woman who places a child for adoption, both in the process of making the decision to do so, and then what does her life look like afterwards, and what's the emotional uh, journey there. So the second book is called Gliding Through Goodbye, and it's a series of recreated diary entries on behalf of my mother. And they were based on some notes that she had left before she passed away, as well as on interviews with 18 different women from a little bit later in her era, but the baby scoop era, which ran from the end of World War II until Roe v. Wade in 1972. And I did extensive interviews there, and all of these women came from different places and were in different places in life right now. But every one of them told me pretty much the same story, that there was never a time that went by when they didn't think of the child that they had left for adoption. So the book is, as I said, is a series of diary entries from the time my mother placed me for adoption to her returning to performing and touring. And she toured over the US and the Caribbean, South America, and Europe. And ultimately, her pregnancy was an accidental one. I should probably take a step back. I was born in 48. She ultimately married the man to whom she would be married for about 40 years in 1955, and then had two children subsequently.
They're both fascinating stories, both the story of your search for your mother and this information about her, and the story of her life, of the decisions that she made and what, led up to and what followed those decisions. What made you want to write these stories down? In the first book, you talk a little bit about where your interest in your birth mother came from. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what led to the decision to write these books?
Yeah, it was quite accidental, honestly. I had an idyllic adoption experience, and I think it's important to note that many people do not. And if you get on social media, some are quite vocal about their thoughts on adoption as an institution. But I felt that through my mother's planning, she put me in a situation where I could not have had a better situation with my adoptive parents, and never really had the impulse then to go out and think and look, gee, I wonder who my mother was, wonder who my father was. And it wasn't until many years later that I had read another book called The Lost, The Search for Six of 6 Million, which is a fabulous book by an author by the name of Daniel Mendelsohn. And he went on a search to identify what happened to some distant relatives during the course of the Holocaust. And of course, he knew precisely that they had perished, but he wanted to know the where and the how and the why. And he managed to do that. And it inspired me to think if he could go back all those years and he could come up with such a precise story, maybe I could do the same thing on a much lesser level. And that's what I did. I just dove in, started to look for who that woman might have been, and it just rolled out in front of me. My thought had always been that she was a high school girl who came home from the prom and was accidentally pregnant. Could not have been any different than that. She was 23 when I was born and at the height of a very, very significant career.
Mm.
And yeah, so I started to write pieces of the search, and I had a very good friend who kept on saying, "You really need to write a book. You need to write a book." And I never had thoughts of writing a book, but as the pieces accumulated, I said, "Okay, maybe there's a book here." And first, there was my mother's story. Second, there was my search. And when I put all my materials with an editor, she said, "Why don't you kind of treat this first book like a deck of cards and shuffle those various chapters. So, a little bit about your search, your mother's story and what you found, a little bit about the search, the next piece you found." And it worked out quite nicely that way.
Mm.
The second book, as I said, was really the result of just this appreciation that I developed for birth mothers. And the book was intended, number one, to follow her physical and emotional journey as she returned to her travels, but also as a tribute to all those other birth mothers who I spoke to who had gone through that same emotional journey, if not the physical.
Mm. Yeah, one of the most touching parts about The Gift Best Given, in addition to the story of your search for her, is the, how do I put it? The wide array of people that you encountered who helped you on your mission, who provided crucial information, all of these different resources that you encountered. Could you talk a little bit about what that search was like? Some of the folks that you encountered along the way?
Yeah, it was magical. And I always say the best part of the journey was just the generosity of the people that I met and their kindness. And every one of them sort of felt like they were now part of the story. My initial biggest challenge was I had a copy of my adoption decree because my adoption was privately arranged. My adoptive mother had the foresight, I suppose, to hold on to that document, and I knew it was there. And when I decided to start searching, I had my birth mother's family name, which was a Polish name. The family lived in Flushing. And so I started searching with that, and I did find a number of documents, but none which led me beyond a given point, with the exception of one, which was a visa application for her traveling from Miami to Rio de Janeiro less than a year after I was born. And it was the first place I saw my mother's picture, but again, it still had that family name, but it listed her as an artista. And I later found out that she was a performer. I found a document online. It was actually written, it was an online magazine written by an antiques dealer in South Carolina who talked about being at an auction and purchasing some items. And she identified that my mother had assumed a stage name and then subsequently became married. And with that stage name, I was then able to dig a little bit deeper. I did my Google search, as I think everyone does, and found another antique dealer in Marietta, Georgia, who had posted a number of pictures of my birth mother along with a copy of her. I think it was her middle school diploma, or it may have been her first professional contract. I'm now not remembering which it was, but she said we were at an auction and this lot came up for sale without any idea of who the woman was, but being a glamorous era and a glamorous person, we bought it. But this was about 5 years before I began my search, and I didn't think there was a prayer she would still have it. I reached out, I made contact with the person, and she immediately said, "Yes, we still have it, but I'm busy right now. Can I call you back?" And yeah, of course. And I sat by the phone for 6 or 7 days and the phone didn't ring. So I reached out again and I was very forthright this time and said the materials you have are of the woman who placed me for adoption when I was born. And within 5 minutes the phone rang and she said, "I'm so sorry, I just forgot about it." And she said, "Yes, we still have it and you need to come here now." And probably within a week or so, my wife and I traveled to Georgia. We met with the woman, we met with her husband, and and they had this information. They just basically pushed the carton across the table and said, "We've been holding this for you. This is all yours." And again, that's the kindness and the generosity. And they've remained good friends since. My one other really interesting kind of encounter was with a woman whose picture was in that carton of ephemera. And she had addressed it to my mother, saying, "To the most wonderful roommate ever, love, Izzy." And this was a beautiful young woman. And it took some doing, but I identified who Izzy was. And I found her son in outside of Minneapolis and explained who I was and said, "I don't know if your mother is even alive, but this is what I'm trying to research." And he said, "Mom is still alive." He said, "I've shared the information that you sent. I shared the pictures that you sent me. She'd love to talk with you." And we talked at length on the telephone. And I said, if I could cobble together enough airline miles and hotel miles, could we come and visit you? And my wife and I did. And we sat with her probably for 4 or 5 hours. Izzy was in a memory care facility, but her son, as her son had promised, she wasn't sure what she had for breakfast that morning, but she knew everything about what happened in 1947. And it was a real pleasure to talk with her. She has sadly passed away since, but she was already in her mid 90s.
It was so affirming just to read how willing people were to help and to reach out and to meet with you. It was just a feel good story, even though there is sadness in it. It's really ultimately very affirming, and I really enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, it was a joyous story. And I think, the people like Izzy were as receptive as they were because of who my mother was.
Mm.
They had a positive feeling there. I've since met first cousins, and they could not have been any more welcoming. And the other people was just kind of the antiques dealer in South Carolina, after we talked for a little bit, told me, what really caught me and got me interested is my daughter had to give up a child for adoption. So there are lots of little connections there. And I think that's the interesting part in going out and talking about my books. It's invariably somebody will come up to me afterwards and say, either I've given up a child or I'm an adoptive mother or I was adopted, and I think the statistics are one out of every four people has some close connection to adoption. So it's been the gift that keeps on giving. There's always a good conversation, always a very kind conversation that comes with every discussion of these books.
So in your second book, Gliding Through Goodbye, I am curious about the further people that you connected with, these women that you spoke to. Could you tell us a little bit through these conversations what you learned about the baby scoop era and what this experience was like for these women?
Well, the baby scoop era was shrouded in number one shame. How could you go out and get yourself pregnant like this? In secrecy, and that we will not tell anybody about this, or in the case of my mother, she told nobody about it. She managed her pregnancy and my adoption pretty much in total secrecy. The only people who ever knew were her eldest sister and her sister's husband. And the other part was the constant refrain of, well, don't think about this, and you'll forget it ever happened. And what I learned from the women who I spoke to subsequently were, number one, that piece about the shame was constant, and many of them still experience that feeling. The secrecy was a big piece of it. Many of them had never revealed themselves to people very, very close to them. And and the other part was they never, never, never forgot. There were women who told me that, there was not a day they didn't wake up and think about the child they had placed. And this is what, 60 and 65 years afterwards. There were some who said, almost embarrassed that they didn't think of the child more often, but I think of that child on his birthday. I think of that child at Christmas. Some of them open enough in their experiences now that their families knew and they would celebrate those birthdays. And there were a small handful who had reunited with those children, some in very positive manners, some in rather disappointing manners, and hurtful. I wouldn't say hurtful, but well, not positive.
Yeah, difficult, difficult. So one of the things that does show in these diary entries that you create from your mother's perspective, that she's constantly thinking about you as she goes along, advancing her career and traveling with these shows. Um, I'm curious if you matched her writing style from the notes. Was there a process of sort of translating the notes into these diary entries? What was your approach?
That's very perceptive. Thank you. She left about 50 pages of handwritten notes, which I assume were left for her once for her son, who is Ted is 8 years younger than I am. Got a half sibling, and he and I are in fairly close contact. And she wrote them ostensibly for him, even though now and again you'll find something in those notes which refers to my husband or my aunt, which, if you would think if you're writing for your son who knows your whole life story, you'd say, your father or your aunt. So, there's this romantic part of me that says, well, maybe she was writing it thinking maybe one day I'd come across it. But he was very generous in sharing those notes with me. And while there was not much in them that I wasn't already aware of by the time I came into possession, I used them very much as a style guide in writing the entries. My first pass at this was kind of, complete sweeping prose. And when I looked at her notes, it was a little bit more staccato. And I'm part of a writing group, and there are a couple of mature ladies in the group who said if I were to write a journal, I would never write it the way you're doing it. It would be more of just a stream of consciousness, thought period, thought period, thought period. And so that's what I went back to. And I'd probably be interested in hearing your thoughts, but as I read it initially, it's a little bit difficult to get the rhythm of the writing because of that staccato nature. But once you understand what it is or how it is that you're reading, I think it flows fine.
Mhm.
I think it replicates exactly the way she would have written those entries.
Yeah, to me, it's sort of it suggested, as you say, the sort of stream of conscious process that, anyone uses when writing a private diary. But also, it's incredibly, even though there's like simple sentence structures and this, sentences are fairly straightforward, there's like incredible honesty and vulnerability in it. And the sort of staccato nature almost suggests that like this isn't easy to write, what I mean?
No, and I don't
Yeah.
imagine it would have been easy to
Yeah.
write.
Hmm.
And I really do feel that the entries represent her. I think, she was very, very attuned to her career and appreciative of where she was at any given time. But again, I think that it was very genuine from the standpoint of this is where I am, this is what I'm doing, but you're never very far from my thoughts.
It's so lovely. And you do go into, what her daily life was like in this career that she was pursuing. It's this really interesting combination of glamorous and grueling, it sounds like.
I would imagine so.
Yeah.
I've talked to a number of performers, some of them were out of the shows that she was in, and every one of them loved the lifestyle, but they also said it was hard work. It was glamorous, it was fun, but it was like being on an old-fashioned circus train. You do your 5 days, you pick up stakes, you go travel for a day, and you're traveling and you're performing again.
Mm. I remember, I forget what country it was exactly, but there's somewhere in South America where she spent 100 days. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that must be like permanent residency, after spending a day or
I
two
thought
in
that
a
was
place.
amazing that they
Yeah.
were there for so long.
Mhm.
That was actually an interesting piece in that somewhere in the process of my research, I learned that there had been a man in that South American tour who wrote a book or was writing a book about his travels with ice vogues. And I started looking for the book, and it had never been published. I made contact with him. He was actually living in Germany. And I've tried several times since, and again, it's an elderly man who may have passed away, but he told me that only two copies of that book existed, both one a carbon copy, one the original, one he had, he didn't know where it was. The other was in the Traveling Entertainment Archives at the University of Texas in Austin. And I just wanted to get on a plane, go to Austin, but it was in the middle of, we were in pandemic time. And I made contact with the archives down there, or the archivist, and he said, yes, we do have it. However, the archives are closed and we're on very, very limited activity here. Ultimately, he faxed or emailed probably, I'm thinking again, 50 pages from that diary or the book that the man wrote. And I would still like to get down there to see it in its entirety, but I got all of the pieces from the time, he and Genevieve, my mother, crossed paths to start touring through the point that he went his way and Genevieve continued on hers, and gave me a lot of good detail about the other people in the show, where they were, and what the activities were.
They're such fascinating stories, and thank you so much for coming to share them with me and our listeners. I am very excited to recommend these books to folks at the library.
Jen, thank you. That's very nice of you. And I really appreciate the work that you put in reading through the books and asking, insightful questions. So thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, listeners, please check out The Gift Best Given and Gliding Through Goodbye. You can find them at your favorite bookstore, library, website. Do you have a website where folks can
I
learn more?
do. The website is www.deganjiauthor.com. And Deganji is D like David, G like George, N like Nancy, GI. So deganjiauthor.com.
Very good. I'll drop that in the show notes so that
Thank
people
you.
can find it. All right. Thank you all for joining us, listeners. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.